Hey, you guys. I recorded part one of part two of chapter four. And so this is part three. I'm going to try to get through it. I want to go ahead and just continue where I left off from the previous video. And I left off where we talked about free worldwide travel, the fact that there were tall buildings or tall structures that people could ascend and be picked up by airships and then dropped off at certain locations all around the world. These tall buildings were used. We talked about star forts, right? And we talked about how previously in these different chapters where these buildings were repurposed. And I'm going to propose the same thing like the author. The star forts were not constructed. They were found and they were repurposed. Okay. I showed you pictures of several star forts and I gave you names for you guys to go look up on your own, or you can do a Google search. And so we're just going to jump right in what we talked about. So airships appear to play a huge role in transportation in the Tartarian reign. It is my belief that the old world buildings we see around the world were actually used to board them. Many of the towers within cathedrals and palaces could have also been used for the very same purpose. Pinnacles have clearly been removed and replaced, and crucifixes and crosses have given it an appearance once again to places of worship. Okay. In several of the books I have researched, I'm constantly drawn to the words free world travel, which would almost certainly have been achieved using airships. Okay. So how would this be possible within a vast number of incredible tall structures strategically located throughout the world? One thing I do know for certain is that they really don't make them like they used to. When we look at the buildings we have designed and constructed since World War II, they seem to be built quickly and cheaply as possible, and today glass and metal are used more frequently. Not a skilled stonesman in sight, and my fear is that they are specifically designed to collapse quickly, so when the next reset happens or another world war, they will disappear just as quickly as they went up. Just look at the London's modern monasteries like the Shard and the Gherkin. You can hardly compare them to the St. Paul's Cathedral or London Bridge, for example, which I believe will be around for many more centuries. And the London Bridge had melanated people, and that was where we were holding the fight. And if you do your research, you will come to find out that there were millions of melanated people that were unalive at that point in time on that bridge. Okay. I'm just going to simply tell you, you just got to go do your research. Okay. I may read something about that at a later point in time, but just not right now. I want to get through this, but you just need to know that things are not what they seem. And I don't want to make this into a race thing, because it's truly about all of us being one big family united. But for the sake of this video, I will just say this and I will leave it at that. You really need to do your research about who the original people of the dome were in this last great reset. Prior to that, who the original people are in the Americas and what role we played over the past 1,000 years. I'm just going to simply say that. All right. It's not what you think. It really is not. And sad to say, a group of people had to write themselves into history and to put themselves above everyone else, when truly all they've done is commit usury and piggyback off the hard work of so-called autochthonous people. All right. I'm just going to leave it at that. If you know, you know, right? So then next up, I want to talk to you about Alexandra Palace in North London. It's another interesting location and a place I have been to many times over the years. In a previous life, I tattooed there during the Great British Tattoo Show each year. Okay. Today, it is mostly empty building and a shadow of its former self. Zachary Denman has a channel on YouTube and is extremely knowledgeable about both Tartaria and Tartarian architecture. So I want you guys to make a note of this guy's name, and I am going to reshare it over on YouTube and over on Facebook. His name again is Zachary, and his last name is Denman, D-E-N is in Nancy, M is in man, A is in apple, N is in Nancy. Okay. Okay, so he's he's well worth watching and provided me with a great deal of information on this. For those of you that don't know about the Alexandria Palace, it was built to mirror the Crystal Palace, another anomaly and almost certainly a Tartarian old world building in South London. It was designed according to Wikipedia in 1875. You know, they got to put their little spin on everything. It was designed way before that, but it says 1875 by John Johnson and Wilfred Neeson. Those are the ones who assumed repurposed it and took over. Okay. Yet no drawings or photographs of the construction exist. Many people actually state that they were told by their ancestors that the palace stood there long before this. However, the place we know today officially opened in May 1873. This one was repurposed. Okay. So, and they claim it was constructed by salvaging the demolished London World Fair of 1862. According to the narrative, the blueprints were drawn up by Owen Jack back in 1859, yet nothing exists to collaborate this. Okay. They just got to make up something out of thin air. When it opened, within just 16 days, a fire broke out and most of the building was destroyed. It then took a further 2 years to repair and reconstruct it. My suspicion is that the first vision saw and questioned things that looked out of place. In fact, it was originally supposed to be a place for education, culture. Many theorists believe it was closely linked to the Great Library of Alexandria in Egypt. Alexandria Palace had numerous Egyptian sculptures and artifacts inside. It also had a railway station that closed in 1954 due to the lack of funding, which I find hard to believe, as well as an organ consisting of 12,000 pipes and 46 ranks, enabling it to achieve any frequency, as well as the vibrato and the tremolo. Why a building other than a place of worship would have such a device is again a mystery. It also had the most incredible stained glass windows, which appear to have been bright crystal once upon a time. But after the fire, when it was replaced with dull glass, its windows are all cymatic in design, just like Tartarian's center of healing. And of course, it is set on a ley line. Okay. For these reasons, it is very clear to me that this was a repurposed Tartarian building. And to support this theory even further, it sits on top of a huge mound of earth, meaning access to it involves climbing a vast number of stairs, thus resembling it having been partly buried during a mud flood. Moreover, it also has had its very own airship, which operated tours, providing passengers with aerial views of the grounds and of London too. Yet when you consider that at that time, London was famously covered in a thick black smoke cloud from the coal fires of the Industrial Revolution below, what they could see escapes me. However, we are told that Dr. Francis Alexander Barton built an airship on the actual grounds of the palace and operated flights from 1902 until 1905. That's bullshit. We created those airships and there's patents out there to show you that. And we operated those during Tartary and before the last reset. Okay. Again, you got people, Cabbage Patch, who came over and assumed things and they gave you this narrative and we've just been fed it and you're supposed to believe it. So it says, why is it for such a short period of time it's not mentioned? In addition to this, and possibly one of the biggest mysteries, is that early photographs taken of this boating lake, a tower huge metal structure, okay, can clearly be seen. In fact, it looks very similar to the Eiffel and Blackpool towers and could be easily explained as the docking station for an airship. However, where it was located now stands a more modern mast, which has been used to transmit radio broadcasts from Alexandria Palace for a number of decades. Personally, I don't believe they would have an airship that close to the building, especially when you consider the previous fire, and this is certainly a returning catastrophe as it was in 1980. Another anomaly is the Masonic Temple building in Chicago, later known as the Capitol building. No idea why it would be called Capitol. With construction apparently starting in 1891 and taking over 9 months. When you see the photograph of this in the center pages, you will find the time scale very hard to believe, but it doesn't stop there. For this building has 21 stories, given the number 3, 9 levels of shops, and was owned by the Masonic Orient Lodge number 33. And the narrative tells us that the building became obsolete due to the poor quality of the elevators. Wikipedia states that the architecture was done by Daniel Bernheim, a dyslexic draftsman from New York and the son of a pharmacist. He failed his entrance exams to Yale and Harvard due to anxiety, but despite the setback, went on to take credit for some of America's most spectacular buildings, including Stonegate Montauk building in 1881, World's Columbian Exposition 1892, the Philadelphia Land Title Building in 1897, plans for Boyle in 1900, plans for downtown Washington, D.C. 1900, and the Flatiron Building in 1901, plans for Manila in 1901, Cleveland Group Plan in 1903, San Francisco's Merchant Exchange in 1904, Washington Union Station in 1907, London's Selfridges in 1909, and plans for Chicago in 1909. You got to ask yourself, what possessed him, or who was this person? And what significance did he play within the elite families? What bloodline did this gentleman come from? Because he had to give up something to get his name associated with this. There's something behind the scenes that we're not seeing. And I bet if you investigate it further, you'll figure it out, right? You'll see it. So it says, as you see, Bernheim was a very busy man indeed. And when you add the fact that in 1871, he was a plate glass salesman and following that a druggist, it's amazing he was able to achieve all of this. His death is a little bizarre too, dying from food poisoning in Heidelberg in 1912. This recurred just 47 days after the sinking of the Titanic, which was a lot of so-called melanated people on the ship. But they don't want you to believe that because they gave us a Hollywood narrative with Leonardo DiCaprio and what's that other, Catherine something? I can't think of her name off the top of my head. But they gave us this narrative that we're supposed to follow. Just going to leave it at that. So it says, so how did a poorly qualified ex-salesman achieve all of this and in a small period of time? To design and oversee the construction of both Selfridges and the entire city of Chicago in the same year simply cannot be true. Bernheim, along with many other architects, appear to have been given the credit for the old world Tartarian buildings that were already there. Okay? Could have been a mason and had to sacrifice something to get this as usury. Like I'm saying, it's usury. There are still thousands of Tartarian buildings around the world. I could easily write an entire book on this subject alone. However, my aim is to give you just enough information to enable you to go on and do your own research. If you decide to do so, there are some cities and towns that are worthy of serious investigation, one of them being Kansas in America. Kansas boasts several castles, which according to Wikipedia were structures built during the Middle Ages and died out by the late 1400s. Bullshit. The first I would like to explore is the city workhouse castle, the city's first prison, and also just happened to be considered by its first superintendent, Major Alfred Brandt, to be the best building Kansas City has. So why spend almost $1 million to construct it just to house criminals, and why in the style of the castle? They claim the architect was James Oliver Hogg, who was just 28 years old when he came to Kansas and started designing a multitude of amazing buildings. Alas, no images of him exist anywhere. He isn't in Wikipedia. Neither is his business partner, A. Wallace Love. It says next there's Tiffany Castle, which is stated as being built in 1909. However, a quick Google search will provide old images of it looking derelict with a tree growing through it. The architect, according to Wikipedia again, was Clifton C. Sloan, and nothing can be found on him anywhere either. Then there is the Sauer Castle, built in 1871 for Anton Sauer, who has little to no history and no mention of his profession, nor how he amassed enough money to build it. The architect for this castle was Asa Bibi Cross, who appears to be taking the credit for designing several grand buildings in a very similar pattern to Daniel Bernheim. These were Cabbage Patch that were utilized. Okay, just gonna tell you. All right, and it says Coronado Heights is next described as a shelter and one of the chain of 7 sandstone bluffs in the Dakota Formation, raising approximately 300 feet. Okay, this looks very old indeed, and again, no record can be found on the architect or builder. As we know, there are castles throughout the world, and we have all grown up reading stories about them, watching movies based around them, and possibly visited them too. However, the narrative we are told surrounding their purpose and the period in which they were built and why doesn't marry up with what we are being told about these in Kansas and many others besides. Most now lay abandoned, and if we are to believe what we are told, seem to have gone from a glory to disparity in a very short period of time. When you consider the cost involved as well as the time and skill required, why would they be left to rot so quickly? I'm going to tell you, if I ever was to come into a wealth of money, I would definitely buy a castle or a very, very, very old cathedral, and I would live in it. I would. I would also build some gardens around it for sure, and everything would be symmetrically and built in a way that would harness the Earth's electromagnetic field and use 0 point energy. Okay, I'm just going to say it. So then it says, this further supports my theory that of other Tartarian researchers that these castles and palaces were already there when the founding fathers of America laid claim to the continent. And they were, because the original people that were here, melanated people, all right. And yeah, we did have some light-skinned folks here too. Like I said, the original people were unalive during the last mud flood. And we read about that in Claudio's work, in Claudio's book. Okay, because he went beyond the ice walls to the ancestral republic. Okay, so I'm just saying, if you know, you know. So what have we learned so far? Okay, we've talked about star forts. We've talked about some of these castles, especially Kansas. So now I'm going to go Google that. That's going to be in my presentation when I do online, when we go through some Tartarian buildings and look at some maps. I'm going to try to make that presentation. I'm going to try not to make it too long, but it might be just under an hour, because I'm going to try to put in as much information as I possibly can while we're researching this together. Okay. So we talked about the star forts. We talked about how they repurposed them. Talked about people just out of the blue being architects and laying claim to these buildings when we know that they were repurposed, right? We talked about the town in Utah, how there were so many farms and homes that were just empty, that people just came right on and they assumed those homes, right? Okay. So then it says, this further supports my theory that of other Tartarian researchers that the castles and palaces were already there when the founding fathers of America had laid claim to the continent. Compounding this, many of the abandoned castles in the New World are now off limits to the public, and some of them for very dubious reasons. Bannerman Castle on the Hudson River within the state of New York lies not only in the taters, but has numerous reasons why the public aren't allowed access. These range from poison ivy being present to large number of venomous snakes. However, it's not just the buildings that interest me, but waterways too, especially when you consider that Tartaria wished for everyone to travel easily and freely. This brings me to the next topic, the canals. These beautiful and incredible man-made rivers can be found throughout the world and were created as a means to transport goods from one place to another, simply and cheaply. Today, many are used for leisure purposes, but if you go back just as recently as 100 years ago, they were the only viable and cost-effective method of distributing essential items like coal. And we know the Mississippi is truly the Nile River because we know we have 7 forks or extensions that lead out to that. And I'll probably pull that up in the presentation and show you guys that, okay? So it says here, and I'm wrapping this up, as with most significant older structures, I believe that canals were also built by the Tartarians. Again, they used esoteric numerology to construct them in the same way they erected their buildings and cities. These precise calculations using the power of 3, 6, and 9 and the angelic number 11 are there for all to see. First of all, my native home, England, boasts the Grand Union Canal, which is 137 miles long. Prime number is 11 and has 166 locks and 6 other canals branching off of it. America has 3,000 miles of inland waterways, including the Chesapeake and Delaware Canal, the Erie Canal, and the Great Loop, which also run through part of Canada. This particular canal is oddly enough 6,000 miles long. Then there is the Karakum Canal in Turkmenistan, with each section carrying 13 cubic meters of water, and finally the Grand Canal in China with 60 bridges and a total length of 1,100 miles. I'm not sure if this is visible from space too, but it does remind me of the Great Wall of China. And there was a Great Wall here around the US or the Americas. I'll put it that way. The wall is considered to be one of the wonders of the world and spans 2,000 miles longer than the Grand Canal, long enough to cover over half of the equator. However, who actually built it and why might not fit in with the narrative we have been given. First of all, the forts along with the wall actually faces China, so appear to be used to monitor or provide defense against the Chinese people. Second, the walls are far higher on the Chinese side, which again appears to be beneficial to those on the other side, and access appears to be on this side too. So why would it be built that way? If it was a defense for China against attack, it is actually the Great Wall of Tartaria. Okay. There are numerous UNESCO sites have had a history that doesn't seem to make much sense. But it's specifically Tartarian buildings that interest me the most. For one, they are far more commonplace, as their architecture can still be found in every town and every city today. All you need to do is look up and look down. The windows of buildings will usually be far too high to be of any use to us today. The rooftops sometimes have the remnants of equipment needed to harness energy from the ether present, and you can't go far without seeing basement windows peeking around or through the pavement. So you know how you walk up to a building, and Andre Stafford, he actually did a video, and I thought he did some videos, he did pictures on his Facebook. Okay, he's a friend of mine, avid researcher, free thinker, critical thinker. If you walk, like for example, Chicago and New York, you'll notice that sometimes you'll have to go down the steps to go into the basement or to the beginning or the entrance of the building. And it's because of the mud flood and how many layers of silt and mud that the building is actually covered. So those buildings go down much more further down and deeper than what we've been told or what we've been shown, because they don't allow us to have access to go further underground than what they really do. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So if you're looking at a building and you see windows at street level, or you see windows right at the base of the concrete, you know that building goes down further. It's deeper than what they're telling you, right? So this is the last part, and I'm wrapping this up. So Are we really expected to believe that when these structures were built, the architects chose to have half a window buried under the gravel, stone, or tarmac? Are we also expected to believe that every house or church was designed with steps leading up to the front door, making it harder to access for many and even harder to move items in and out of? So I end this chapter with two questions. Why do the old government buildings in your town look exactly the same as the ones in my town and every other major town or a city in the world? And then the second thing is, why would they use Greco-Roman architecture in Argentina, New Zealand, Japan, if the Greeks and Romans never went there? Nor did architects have traveled to Greece and Rome. Greece and Rome is just a made-up narrative, right? It is a made-up narrative because it's been posed that the Greeks and Romans were in the same period as the Egyptians, as the same period as Tartaria. So it's like we have merging timelines and they overlap. Does that make sense what I'm saying? So when you do your research, you'll discover that there's quite a few things that don't line up, especially specifically as to what they're telling you, what these buildings are used for. And then also when you really start to look at, for example, the Smithsonian and how it's played out over the last 100 years, 300 years. Okay. When it was founded, who founded it. And you can go back and do your research over giants. And you can see every major city here in the U.S., they have a Smithsonian representative that will come in and collect the remains, these burial mounds, and then the remains disappear. There's over 1,000 articles online if you know where to go look, even the Macrofiche. But you can go look and you'll be able to see where these major newspapers like the New York Times and the Chicago Tribune talked about the Smithsonian being called out and collecting the remains. And then next thing you know, the Smithsonian doesn't have any records of ever being at the burial site or the mound. Mysteriously enough, when you see that these mounds, they have them come in and they collect the remains, and then they actually section these places off to where they are supposed to be Indian burial lands or sacred lands, and where the government comes in and sets up shop and says, okay, well, these are deemed national lands, and so no one can build there. Giving limited access to the public, So you just got to look at things for where they are, especially when you start to look at how many acres the U.S. and Canada and Mexico have together, and then how many acres are sectioned off or quarantined off for national parks in every state. When you start to look at the map, just here in the Americas in the West, look at the maps, look at how much wilderness there is, especially in Alaska and Canada. How many people live in certain quadrants, and then where the national parks are. And then you lay that in with the disappearances. And then when you look at the national parks, you look at the cities, you start to look at each major city and see how many Tartarian buildings were set up there. I'm just going to say it. It's actually a fantastic puzzle piece when you look at it. Just going to say. Anyway, I thank you guys for joining me. We finished up chapter 4. When we come back, I'm going to read chapter 5. And we're also going to deep dive into some Tartarian buildings, look at some canals, some star forts, and we're going to take a look at some interesting things online this time. I'm going to share my screen, pull that information up, and we'll get right to it. Anyway, thank you guys for joining me for part 3 of part 4, chapter 4. And you guys have an amazing night. And remember what I always say, be the change you want to see all around this Earth Dome, because it's up to you and I to make a positive change. I hope you guys have enjoyed the reading, and I hope you've gotten something out of it and it's piqued your curiosity. I'll talk to you guys soon.